It took 4 years for Final Fantasy to branch out beyond the franchise. Its move to the American NES in 1990 began budding its worldwide appeal, and its evolution on the Super Famicom in 1991 established it as a returning entity gamers could depend on and look forward to. Super Mario Land for the Game Boy in 1989 invited all of Nintendo's brightest to sacrifice color and continuity for the promise of owning gamers' pockets across the planet. The first spin-off in the series was released in Japan as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, which could be translated as Holy Sword Legend Final Fantasy Side Story. The name Seiken Densetsu was actually trademarked by Square in 1987, the same year the first Final launched in Japan, but was saved until the Game Boy game's working title, Gemma Knights, was dropped. Gaiden arrived in stores on June 8, 1991, 1 month before Final Fantasy IV. Seiken Densetsu was released for the Game Boy in America on November 1st as Final Fantasy Adventure. It was Koichi Ishii's first directorial project, and the first fantasy writer Yoshinori Kitase ever worked on. The music was composed by Kenji Ito, with various franchise references contributed by Nobuo Uematsu. It followed the plight of an imprisoned gladiator who thirsted for revenge after learning of an evil plot hatched between the Dark Lord and the wizard Julius. A look at Adventure's interface might inspire thoughts of another overhead sword and shield action-based RPG, but Link awakened in his first Game Boy outing almost exactly 2 years later. Adventure's hero lacked a green tunic, but brandished a power bar that indicated the strength of his attacks. Several friendly faces he met while rolling along could join his party and add their abilities. While it might appear as if Adventure was stuck without a sequel, it actually had 8 follow-ups. When the first of these was brought to the US, it was renamed Secret of Mana, and the series secured the subname for years to come. A remake of Adventure was released for the Game Boy Advance in 2003 called Sword of Mana, reflecting on the original's bizarre combination of the two Square franchises. Adventure was a handheld offspring that would grow to have grandchildren of its own one day. But Square's second spin-off a year later stood solo. Mystic Quest was the first Final Fantasy game to be initially released in the United States. It debuted on October 5th, 1992, almost a year before it was available in Japan. The turn-based Super Nintendo Trip was created with American audiences in mind, to encourage the non-RPG playing bulk of the gaming community to give the growing genre a try. To acclimate new users to the experience, the game was simplified from the chiseled template Square had been refining, so save points, manually adjusted armor, and random battles were thrown out. What was left told the story of a map split into 4 elemental regions, each fueled by the power of their corresponding crystal. Similar to the prophecy in Final Fantasy I, it was foretold that these power sources would be stolen, and a knight would have to fight to retrieve them. A mysterious man named White bestowed a youth named Benjamin with the uneasy task, and along with fellow battle partners Kaylee, Tristram, Reuben, and Phoebe, Ben began his crusade for the crystals. As another series offshoot to attend the Hyrule School of Action-Adventure, there were added challenges like acquiring tools, using them in the overworld, and solving various environmental puzzles. Instead of occasionally initiating unseen battles, the enemies in Mystic Quest stood still on the map, and the encounters were viewed from a third-person, head-on perspective. In combat, players could run, control their allies, or choose from 4 action options. Following Final Fantasy IV, Mystic Quest had a lot to live up to. Those expecting it to be a step up marked it below the standards previously set by the franchise, and it came up short in its attempt to find a brand new audience. But given that it never received a sequel, remake, or port, the original 16-bit Expedition remains a guilty pleasure and forgotten treasure in the hearts of many that finished it. But few things incite a wave of warm nostalgia like Chocobo. And not the transports gamers have tamed over the years, but the squawking superstar that is currently played host to 11 different games, the majority of them released solely in Japan. His overseas endeavors started with Chocobo's Dungeon in 1997, which was the third in the Dungeon series that would also grow games to include characters from Dragon Quest and Pokemon. It was released for the PlayStation in Japan on December 23, 1997. Along with making mandatory appearances in the core sequels afterward, Chocobo tracks were laid on new consoles and peripherals. Chocobo Stallion was inspired by the raising and racing minigame from 7, and Chocobo World was the Pocket Station plug-in extension from Final Fantasy VIII. Other outings included Dice Day Chocobo, a board game simulator which later influenced a Game Boy Advance release called Chocobo Land, Harataku Chocobo, an occupation simulator, and Chocobo de Mobile, a batch of on-the-go minigames. In the 10 years since the boisterous bird showed it could be bred for its own brand of RPG cuteness, only 3 of its games have been released in the States. The first was the 1998 PlayStation sequel to Chocobo's Dungeon, which surprisingly left the 2 at the end of the American title after Square had notoriously renumbered all prior fantasy-related crossovers. Its pint-sized plot included an appearance from the pilot Sid and a pink-haired white mage named Shiroma. A year later, the same characters, along with a handful of series job cameos, made an appearance in an event that mixed magic with Mario Kart. Chocobo Racing also arrived on the PlayStation, and to date is the only standalone driving game to include series familiars like a Black Mage or Behemoth. 2006 saw the release of Final Fantasy Fables, Chocobo Tales for the Nintendo DS. Dealing out more than another dungeon crawler, Tales followed Chocobo as he dived into 8 storybook worlds that crossed Square's fantasies with popular fables. To celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Chocobo craze, Square announced a 3rd dungeon game being developed as a Nintendo Wii exclusive. Its title is loosely translated as Labyrinth of Forgotten Time, and its underground layers actually exist in people's minds, requiring the series mascot to destroy their worst nightmares firsthand. Chocobo games might be as far as fans are willing to go while still considering the subject matter related to the series they cherish. But it's hard to deny the charm each chirp a Chocobo makes, whether it's taking the pole position in a pair of rollerblades or descending into the deepest dungeon to save its friends. The first Final Fantasy cutscene lit up gamers' televisions around the world when 7 was released in 1997, and when an animated camera pulled back to reveal the city of Midgar in its entirety. Fans were forever hooked on the technology, as well as the crucial tool for telling a story as epic as the one Square was attempting. The closest thing fans had seen to a strictly animated retelling of any Final Fantasy story was an episode of Captain N, the Game Master, called The Fractured Fantasy of Captain N, that aired on October 26, 1991. It was the 34th and final episode of the short-lived series. But then, 3 years later in '94, players got their first chance to sit back and watch a Final Fantasy called Legend of the Crystals, released directly to VHS in 4 episodes. The original video animation produced by Madhouse Studios was a sequel to Final Fantasy V, and it took place 200 years after the Super Famicom RPG. The cast was largely unfamiliar, although the novice summoner Lenali was said to be a direct descendant of Bartz, and Lena's lineage, the Kingdom of Tycoon, returned. The other lead warriors, Pretz, Valkis, and Rouge, didn't realize their significance until Mid appeared, as a disembodied spirit, to fill in the heroes and viewers on what had happened since his death. Hand-drawn animation and Final Fantasy went together beautifully, but the series-branded characters would only be crafted by computers as the games continued. The only additional paper and ink project aired on Japanese television 4 years later. Loosely based on the 14-year-old franchise, Final Fantasy Unlimited aired for 25 episodes starting on October 2nd, 2001. The series took the brand and ran with it, offering up new monsters, areas, characters, and scenarios that 10 games in the franchise had yet to produce. The anime studio Gonzo and director Mahiro Maeda created their own version of the popular universe called Wonderland, but it still contained some iconic cameos. Chocobos and Cactar engaged the party on several occasions. A Cid was responsible for the bulk of the available modes of travel, and a ghost train, similar in theme to the Phantom model in Final Fantasy VI, brought the children Ai and Yu, along with their impromptu guardian Lisa, to the strange world in search of their parents. The story of Unlimited ended abruptly, but continued on in various novels and comic books. While these episodes were happily gobbled up by fans who added them to the decades worth of media unleashed by the franchise, they weren't dreamt up or executed by the main minds behind Square's foremost properties. It seemed those creative forces were interested in focusing on little other than placing more polished Roman numerals in a row. But little did fans know that the ideas Sakaguchi had been gathering since his mother died would eventually become a feature film that would break new ground in realistic digital animation. Sakaguchi signed on to direct the project following Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy Spirits Within premiered on July 13, 2001, within a week of the release of 10. It was produced by Chris Lee, who also produced Superman Returns. It was written by Al Reinert and Jeff Vinter, who also wrote Apollo 13 and I, Robot. The music was composed by Elliot Goldenthal, who had 2 Academy Award nominations and would win the Golden Idol in 2002 for Frida. Spirits Within had a tremendous cast, assembling the most recognizable group of actors for any Final Fantasy project on a console or in a DVD player. The ensemble included Alec Baldwin, Ming Na, Ving Rhames, Steve Buscemi, and Perry Gilpin, with James Woods as the stubbornly destructive General Hein and Donald Sutherland as the patient and practical scientist, Dr. Sid. The 106-minute pre-rendered cutscene took an overwhelming powerhouse of processing technology to create. Square acquired 4 SGI Origin 2000 servers, 4 Onyx 2 systems, 167 Octane workstations, and rendered each frame on 960 Pentium 2s. The film was as big a risk as Final Fantasy I and VII, but Square's creativity hadn't failed them. Yet. The major concern was that Spirits Within, as gamers would soon discover, had very little to do with Final Fantasy. It's the only story Sakaguchi has ever conjured that took place on Earth, with constant real-world reminders like the moon, New York City, and a subtle cameo by the creator himself. It referred to Gaia as an Earth Mother Force, gave an unmistakable visual homage to Seven's livestream, and chocobo designs made almost invisible appearances, but everything else was straight science fiction. Perhaps for this reason, Spirits Within finished its box office run as an unbelievable bomb. Square lost more money on the film than any project they had previously undertaken. The movie took $137 million to make, including its $30 million marketing budget, and its theatrical yield barely surpassed $44 million. This ended Square Pictures, but before they closed their doors, they reused their technology for a portion of the 2003 short collection, The Animatrix, called The Final Flight of the Osiris. Neither the Matrix crew nor the studio staff would survive the fateful mission. Madhouse, the studio behind Legend of the Crystals, also produced an animated short for the compilation of Final Fantasy VII that began in 2004, called Last Order. The 25-minute duo of flashbacks followed the memories of Turk Commander Zhang. Half of the short reflected on the destruction of Nibelheim, while the other focused on Zack and Cloud's escape from Shinra forces. Last Order was released as an extra with a film that, unlike Spirits Within, never received a theatrical release. To date, it's the only motion picture sequel to a Final Fantasy game ever created. Final Fantasy VII Advent Children was released in Japan on September 14, 2005, and the red carpet was rolled out in the United States on April 25th. It was only released on DVD and PSP UMD. It was directed by Tetsuya Nomura, who originally drew the characters. Takeshi Nozue co-directed after supervising the animated cutscenes in 9, 10, and 10-2. Yoshinori Kitase, who directed 7, produced the film along with Shinji Hashimoto, who also produced 8 and 9. AC was written by Kazushige Nojima, who scripted the bulk of 7, 8, 10, and 10-2, as well as compilation pieces Crisis Core and Before Crisis. The music was written entirely by Nobuo Uematsu. Advent Children picked up the story 2 years after Meteor almost removed Midgar from the map. It brought back all the surviving characters, and even some that were presumed dead. To give them life like never before, voices were assigned, including actresses Rachel Lee Cook and Mina Suvari. 11 actors were also cast to perform the movement for each model, including fight choreography unlike fans or moviegoers had ever seen. More significant, though, was the startling transition each of the heroes made once their blocky PlayStation personas were realistically rendered, thanks to Square's latest leap in computer animation. Tetsuya Nomura's designs were all given flesh and blood, with detail rivaled only by the cutscenes in Final Fantasy XII. The film revisited several familiar locations, but also introduced a few new villains. 3 supposed siblings of Sephiroth, led by the sinister Kadaj, suddenly appeared and demanded to know the whereabouts of Jenova, who they claimed was their mother. With the remains of Shinra and the Turks keeping the corpse under wraps, and Cloud trying his best to avoid more conflict and responsibility, the 3 troublemakers brought the world back to the brink of destruction. They used a plague called Geostigma to rally a group of infected children and strike at the planet they felt was killing them. Cloud got assistance from his former party members, but ultimately had to face Kadaj himself. This, and a rumored second showdown with Sephiroth, vacuumed 93% of the original shipment of DVDs, 420,000 copies, off store shelves in the first week. More of the saga became available in a story collection called On the Way to a Smile, written by Kazushige Nojima. Adventure, Mystic Quest, Chocobo, Unlimited, Legend of the Crystals, Spirits Within, Last Order, Advent Children. At first glance, these developments from Square seem to share no similarities. From action-adventure handheld games, to card-based child-friendly puzzlers, to episodic television, to motion pictures meant for the big and small screen, they have no direct link to speak of. But unified, they represent the power in the notion of Final Fantasy. Simply attaching its name to something invokes a sense of prestige and excitement. This inherent hype can either lead to colossal disappointment or universal acclaim. The series is famous for constantly reinventing itself, so when it branches out into new genres, consoles, and mediums, the world waits and wonders, what will Square do next? We continue our look at the outskirts of the series next week, when its name proved strong enough to build 3 separate franchises. The first borrowed the name when it was stealthily brought to America. The second formed a multiplayer quest around the Chronicles of the Crystal, and the third brought about an unlikely pair of 2 of the most dominant forces in children's entertainment.